She ordered the old black man to move. 15 minutes later, the pilot stopped the flight and saluted him. The announcement echoed through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport like a wake-up call. Flight 847 to Chicago O'Hare, now boarding first class and priority passengers at gate C-19. The gate area buzzed with the familiar symphony of rolling luggage, clicking heels, and hushed phone conversations that painted the backdrop of modern air travel. Thomas Elwood heard the call but didn't rush. At 78, he had learned that life moved at its own pace, regardless of how fast you tried to push it. He stood slowly from the uncomfortable gate chair, his weathered hands gripping a leather briefcase that had seen more airports than most pilots. The case was old, older than some of the planes he'd once known intimately, but it held together with the same quiet dignity that Thomas carried himself. His overcoat had seen better decades. The black wool was faded to charcoal in places, and one pocket had been mended so many times it looked like a small patchwork quilt. But Thomas wore it like armor, a shield against a world that had often been less than kind. Beneath it, his clothes were clean and pressed, a white button-down shirt, dark slacks, and shoes that gleamed despite their age. He believed in presenting himself with respect, even when that respect wasn't always returned. The boarding line moved with typical airport efficiency, which is to say, not very efficiently at all. Thomas waited patiently as families juggled carry-ons and business travelers tapped frantically on their phones, already mentally aboard their flights. When his turn came, he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent with a slight nod. "Have a wonderful flight, Mr. Elwood," the young woman said, glancing at his ticket. Her smile was genuine, not the practiced customer service expression he'd grown accustomed to seeing. "Thank you, miss," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the soft cadence of someone who had spent years teaching others to listen carefully. The jet bridge stretched ahead like a tunnel to somewhere new, though Thomas wasn't sure where new might lead at his age. His steps were measured but steady as he made his way toward the aircraft. Behind him, he could hear the growing crowd of passengers, their conversations blending into a familiar hum of travel anxiety and excitement. Flight 847 was a Boeing 757. Thomas knew this before he even stepped aboard. He could identify aircraft by their engine sound, their boarding door height, even the way they sat on the tarmac. It was a skill that had served him well over the years, though few people ever thought to ask an elderly black man about aviation expertise. "Welcome aboard," said the flight attendant at the door, her name tag reading Kayla. She was young, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes and a smile that reached them. "First class is right this way." Thomas nodded and moved down the narrow aisle. First class on this aircraft wasn't particularly luxurious, just wider seats and a bit more legroom, but it represented something more significant than comfort. It represented progress, even if that progress had taken longer than it should have. Seat 2A was on the left side, a window seat. Thomas settled in carefully, placing his briefcase on the floor beside his feet. Through the small porthole, he could see ground crew moving with practiced efficiency, preparing the aircraft for departure. Their movements were like a choreographed dance he'd watched thousands of times before, each person playing their part in the complex symphony of flight. The seat was comfortable enough, and Thomas allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. He'd earned this seat, not just with the price of the ticket, but with decades of work that most passengers would never know about or understand. His fingers traced the armrests absently as other first-class passengers began to board. A well-dressed couple in their 50s took seats across the aisle, followed by a businessman who immediately pulled out his laptop and began typing furiously. Then came a family with 2 young children who were clearly excited about their flight. The little girl pressed her face to the window, while her brother peppered his parents with questions about flying. Thomas smiled at the children's enthusiasm. He remembered when flying was still magical for most people, before it became just another form of transportation. There was something beautiful about seeing that wonder through young eyes. Then she arrived. Cynthia Wells strode down the aisle like she owned not just her seat, but the entire aircraft. Everything about her screamed expensive, from her perfectly styled blonde hair to her designer handbag that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her heels clicked authoritatively against the cabin floor, and her eyes swept the first-class cabin with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to being catered to. She stopped abruptly when she saw Thomas. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who wasn't really asking. "I think there's been some mistake." Thomas looked up from his window, meeting her gaze with calm, patient eyes that had seen this moment play out in various forms throughout his life. He said nothing, but his grip on his overcoat tightened almost imperceptibly. "This is first class," Cynthia continued, her voice rising slightly. "Premium seating. I paid extra for a certain experience." The other passengers began to notice the commotion. Conversations quieted, and heads turned discreetly in their direction. The businessman looked up from his laptop with obvious annoyance, while the family with children shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" Kayla appeared at Cynthia's elbow, her professional smile intact but her eyes showing concern. "Yes, there is a problem," Cynthia said, gesturing toward Thomas without looking at him directly. "He's obviously in the wrong section. This is supposed to be a premium experience. Why is he here?" The words hung in the recycled air of the cabin like smoke from a fire that threatened to spread. Thomas had heard variations of this question his entire life, though it stung no less now than it had decades ago. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some curious, others embarrassed, a few nodding in unconscious agreement with Cynthia's assumption. "I need you to ask him to move to his correct seat," Cynthia demanded, crossing her arms. "I'm not paying first-class prices to sit next to." She let the sentence hang unfinished, but everyone understood her meaning. Kayla's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd been a flight attendant for 6 years and had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this situation required careful handling. She turned to Thomas with apologetic eyes. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Thomas reached into his coat pocket slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified despite the humiliation of the moment. He handed Kayla his boarding pass without a word, his expression unchanged. Kayla examined the pass carefully, though she already knew what she would find. "Mr. Elwood, you are indeed in seat 2A, first class. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." The confirmation hit Cynthia like a physical blow. Her face flushed red, but instead of apologizing or backing down, she doubled down on her position. "Well, there must be some mistake with the ticketing system," she insisted. "I want to speak to someone in charge. This isn't what I paid for." "Ma'am, I can assure you that our ticketing system is accurate," Kayla replied, her voice remaining professional despite the obvious tension. "Mr. Elwood has every right to be in his assigned seat." Thomas finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "It's all right, miss. I'm used to this." Those 5 words, "I'm used to this," carried the weight of a lifetime. They spoke of countless moments when he'd been questioned, challenged, or asked to prove his right to exist in spaces that others took for granted. They spoke of dignity maintained in the face of indignity, of grace under pressure that should never have been applied. Cynthia looked around the cabin, perhaps expecting support from other passengers, but found only uncomfortable silence and averted gazes. The businessman had returned to his laptop, typing more aggressively than before. The family was whispering quietly to their children, trying to explain something that shouldn't need explaining. "Fine," Cynthia said finally, her voice dripping with displeasure. "But I want it noted that this is not the experience I was promised." She took her seat, 2C, directly across the aisle from Thomas, with theatrical reluctance, making sure everyone understood her dissatisfaction. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, probably crafting a complaint to the airline about the quality of their first-class passengers. Kayla lingered for a moment, her eyes meeting Thomas's with a look of sincere apology. "I'm very sorry about that, Mr. Elwood. Is there anything I can get you before takeoff?" "No, thank you, miss," Thomas replied. "You handled that just fine." As Kayla moved away to continue her pre-flight duties, Thomas turned back to his window. The ground crew was still working below, and he watched them with the practiced eye of someone who understood their every movement. In a few minutes they would push back from the gate, taxi to the runway, and lift off into the sky, a process that never failed to seem miraculous, no matter how many times you witnessed it. He pulled his overcoat closer around himself, not from cold but from something deeper, a need for protection against a world that still, after all these years, questioned his right to be where he was. But Thomas Elwood had spent his entire life proving that he belonged in places where others said he didn't. Today would be no different. As the last passengers boarded and the cabin doors closed, Thomas closed his eyes and allowed himself a small smile. If Cynthia Wells only knew who she was sitting across from, she might have asked for his autograph instead of his removal. But that was a story for another moment, a story that was about to unfold at 30,000 feet. The plane was ready for departure, and Thomas Elwood was ready for his final flight. The boarding process continued with the mechanical efficiency that Thomas had observed countless times before. Coach passengers filed past first class in their usual parade of rolling bags, crying babies, and hairy travelers clutching boarding passes. Some glanced curiously at the first-class cabin, that aspirational space that seemed so close yet remained financially out of reach for most. Kayla moved through the cabin with practiced grace, helping passengers stow their carry-on luggage and settle into their seats. She had nearly finished her pre-flight duties when she noticed Thomas struggling slightly with his briefcase. The old leather case was wedged awkwardly between his feet and the seat in front of him, and his arthritic hands were having difficulty maneuvering it into a more comfortable position. "Let me help you with that, Mr. Elwood," she said, approaching with genuine concern rather than mere professional courtesy. Thomas looked up, momentarily surprised by the offer. In his experience, help was rarely offered without being asked, especially from strangers in airports. "That's very kind of you, miss, but I can manage." "Nonsense," Kayla replied gently. "These overhead bins can be tricky, and there's a perfect spot right above your seat." Before Thomas could protest further, she had gently taken the briefcase from his hands. The case was heavier than she'd expected, not just from its contents, but from the weight of age and use. The leather was worn smooth in places where hands had gripped it over decades of travel, and the brass clasps showed the green patina of time. As Kayla lifted the briefcase toward the overhead compartment, one of the old clasps, weakened by years of opening and closing, suddenly gave way. The case tilted, and its contents shifted dramatically. Papers scattered slightly, and several items slid toward the opening. "Oh no!" Kayla exclaimed, immediately lowering the case to prevent anything from falling to the floor. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Elwood. The clasp must have—" "It's all right," Thomas said quickly, his voice carrying a note of urgency he tried to suppress. "These old cases sometimes have minds of their own." But it was too late to prevent what happened next. As Kayla attempted to close the briefcase, a thick manila envelope slipped from between some papers and slid partially out of the case. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking, and sealed with old-fashioned red wax. But what caught Kayla's attention immediately was the handwriting on the front. The address was written in careful cursive script, the kind of penmanship that belonged to an earlier generation when handwriting was considered an art form. The ink was dark blue, applied with what was clearly a fountain pen, and each letter was formed with deliberate precision. "To Captain Jack Whitmore, Gate C-19. Urgent. Personal." Kayla stared at the envelope for a moment, her mind processing what she was seeing. Captain Jack Whitmore was their pilot. She'd worked with him dozens of times over the past 2 years. He was known throughout the airline as one of their most skilled and respected captains, a man whose calm professionalism had earned him a reputation among both crew and passengers. But how did this elderly passenger know Captain Whitmore? And why was he carrying what appeared to be a personal letter addressed to him? "Mr. Elwood," Kayla said carefully, holding the envelope so he could see it. "This appears to be addressed to our captain." Thomas's eyes fixed on the envelope, and for just a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked. She saw something flash across his face, not embarrassment at being caught with something he shouldn't have, but something deeper. Sadness, perhaps. Or maybe resignation. "Yes," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was hoping to give it to him." Kayla felt a chill of curiosity mixed with concern. In her 6 years as a flight attendant, she'd seen passengers try to contact pilots for various reasons, usually complaints about turbulence or requests for cockpit tours. But this felt different. The formality of the envelope, the careful handwriting, the wax seal, this wasn't a casual note or a complaint letter. "Would you like me to deliver it to him?" she asked, surprised by her own offer. Technically, she wasn't supposed to carry personal correspondence between passengers and crew members. But something about the situation, about Thomas himself, made her want to help. Thomas studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could be trusted with something important. Finally, he nodded once, a small movement that somehow carried the weight of a major decision. "If you wouldn't mind," he said. It's something he should see before we take off." The urgency in his voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't just a letter. It was something that mattered, something that needed to be delivered soon rather than later. Kayla took the envelope carefully, noting its weight. Whatever was inside wasn't just a letter. There were other items, thicker items that created small bulges in the paper. She could feel what might be photographs or documents, and something small and hard that could have been jewelry or a small medal. "I'll take it to him right away," she promised, tucking the envelope securely under her arm. "Thank you," Thomas said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. Tell him it's from his first instructor." The words hit Kayla like a physical blow. Captain Whitmore's first instructor? She looked at Thomas with new eyes, seeing him not as the elderly passenger who'd been humiliated by Cynthia Wells, but as someone with a connection to aviation that she'd never suspected. "His first instructor?" she repeated, wanting to make sure she'd heard correctly. Thomas nodded, but his expression had closed off again, returning to the quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the boarding process. "He'll understand when he sees it." Kayla wanted to ask more questions. How did Thomas know Captain Whitmore? When had he been his instructor? What was in the envelope that was so urgent? But something in Thomas's demeanor told her that the conversation was over. He'd shared what he was willing to share, and the rest would have to wait. "I'll deliver it right now," she said, moving toward the front of the cabin. As she walked toward the cockpit, Kayla found herself glancing back at Thomas. He had settled back into his seat and was staring out the window again, but there was something different about him now. The mysterious envelope had revealed a layer of his story that changed everything she thought she knew about the quiet man in seat 2A. The cockpit door loomed ahead, and Kayla realized she was about to deliver a message that might change the entire flight. She had no idea how right she was. Captain Jack Whitmore was in his element. The cockpit of the Boeing 757 was his sanctuary, a place where everything had its purpose, every switch had its function, and every decision could mean the difference between a routine flight and a memorable one. At 52, he had logged over 15,000 flight hours, earned the respect of every crew member he'd worked with, and maintained a safety record that was the envy of pilots half his age. He was running through his pre-flight checklist with First Officer Sarah Martinez, a competent pilot in her early 30s who had learned to appreciate Jack's methodical approach to aviation. Their routine was comfortable and efficient. Jack would call out each item, Sarah would verify and respond, and together they would ensure that every system was functioning perfectly before they ever thought about leaving the ground. "Engine parameters?" Jack called out, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with practiced precision. "Within normal limits," Sarah responded, checking her own displays. "Flight controls?" "Checked and free." They were nearly finished with their preparations when they heard the distinctive knock that indicated someone was requesting entry to the cockpit. In the post-9/11 world, cockpit security was paramount, and the crew followed strict protocols for any interruptions during pre-flight procedures. Jack glanced at the small monitor that showed the area just outside the cockpit door. He recognized Kayla immediately. They'd worked together on numerous flights, and she was one of the most professional flight attendants in the airline's roster. "Come in, Kayla," he called out after pressing the door release button. Kayla entered the cockpit, and Jack immediately noticed something different about her demeanor. She was holding an envelope, and her expression carried a mixture of curiosity and concern that he'd never seen before. "Captain Whitmore," she began, her voice slightly hesitant, "I have something for you from one of the passengers. He said it was urgent and that you should see it before takeoff." Jack accepted the envelope, immediately noting its formal appearance. The cream-colored paper was expensive, the kind used for important correspondence. The handwriting was elegant, precise, the penmanship of someone from a generation that valued such things. But it was the name written in careful cursive that made Jack's world suddenly tilt on its axis. "Captain Jack Whitmore, Gate C-19. Urgent. Personal." The handwriting was familiar, hauntingly so. Jack had seen it before, decades ago, on flight lesson plans and evaluation forms. His hands began to tremble slightly as he turned the envelope over and saw the red wax seal, old-fashioned and formal, just like the man who had taught him that aviation was about more than just flying. It was about precision, respect, and honor. "Who gave this to you?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "An elderly gentleman in C-2A," Kayla replied. "He said to tell you it was from your first instructor." The words hit Jack like turbulence at altitude, sudden, jarring, and impossible to ignore. His first instructor. Thomas Elwood. The man who had changed his life 40 years ago was sitting in his cabin, and Jack had no idea he was there. With trembling fingers, Jack broke the wax seal. The envelope was thicker than he'd expected, containing more than just a letter. As he opened it, several items slid out onto his lap. The first thing he saw was the letter itself, written on the same expensive paper as the envelope. The handwriting was Thomas's, though slightly shakier now than it had been decades ago. Jack's eyes went immediately to the signature at the bottom. "With honor and gratitude, Thomas Elwood, your first flight instructor, 1985. But it was the other items that nearly brought tears to his eyes. A small pair of pilot's wings, not the modern pins that airlines issued now, but the classic design from the 1980s, with its intricate details and solid weight. These were the wings Thomas had given him when he'd completed his first solo flight, a tradition that belonged to an era when flight instruction was as much about character building as it was about technical skill. Beneath the wings was a folded certificate, yellowed with age but still perfectly preserved. Jack unfolded it carefully, and his breath caught in his throat. It was Thomas's retirement notice from the aviation training program, dated just 6 months after Jack had earned his commercial pilot's license. Thomas had retired quietly, without fanfare, just as he had lived his entire career. The letter itself was brief but devastating in its simplicity. "Dear Captain Whitmore, I hope this letter finds you well and still flying with the precision and honor I tried to teach you all those years ago. I have followed your career from afar and am proud of the pilot and man you have become. Today marks my final flight as a passenger, and I wanted you to know that seeing your name on the crew roster felt like a gift from the aviation gods. You were always my most dedicated student, and knowing that you are still in the sky gives my heart peace as I prepare to land for the last time. I never asked for recognition or fanfare, that was never my way. But I wanted you to have these tokens of our time together, along with my retirement certificate that I never had the chance to share with anyone who would understand its meaning. Fly safe, Captain. You have exceeded every expectation I ever had for you. With honor and gratitude, Thomas Elwood, your first instructor, 1985". Jack sat in stunned silence, the letters shaking in his hands. 40 years ago, Thomas Elwood had been the only black flight instructor at the training facility, a man who had faced challenges and barriers that Jack, as a young white pilot, had never fully understood. But Thomas had never let those challenges diminish his dedication to teaching or his belief in his students' potential. "Captain?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Jack looked up, suddenly remembering where he was. The cockpit, the pre-flight checklist, the schedule they needed to maintain, all of it seemed insignificant compared to the man sitting in C-2A. "Kayla," he said, his voice stronger now but carrying an emotion that neither woman had ever heard from their usually composed captain. "The passenger in 2A, describe him to me." "Elderly black gentleman, Probably late 70s, Kayla replied. Very dignified, wearing an old overcoat. He's been having some trouble with another passenger who thought he was in the wrong section. Jack's jaw tightened. The idea that anyone would question Thomas's right to be anywhere was almost too much to bear. This was a man who had shaped the careers of dozens of pilots, who had helped integrate aviation training during an era when such integration required courage that few possessed. Change of plans? Jack announced, standing up from his seat with sudden determination. We're not pushing back yet. Sir? Sarah looked confused. Is there a mechanical issue? No, Jack replied, carefully folding the letter and placing the wings in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. There's something I need to do first. Something that should have been done years ago. The pushback tractor was already positioned behind Flight 847, its operator waiting for the signal to begin the process of backing the aircraft away from the gate. Ground control had cleared them for departure, the cabin doors were secure, and all systems showed green. Everything was proceeding according to the carefully choreographed dance of commercial aviation, until Captain Jack Whitmore made a decision that would stop everything in its tracks. Ground control, this is United 847. Jack's voice crackled over the radio, steady but carrying an undertone that his first officer had never heard before. Request to delay pushback. We have a passenger situation that requires immediate attention. Sarah Martinez looked at her captain with barely concealed confusion. In all her years of flying, she'd never seen Jack deviate from standard procedures without a clear mechanical or safety issue. Passenger situations were typically handled by the flight attendants, not by stopping an entire flight operation. United 847, ground control. Confirm you're requesting a delay? We have you cleared for pushback and taxi. Affirmative, ground control. We need a few minutes to resolve an onboard matter. We'll advise when ready to proceed. Roger 847. Hold your position. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice that something wasn't right. The familiar sounds of departure preparation, the closing of overhead bins, the final safety announcements, the low rumble of engines spooling up, had been replaced by an unusual stillness. People checked their watches, glanced out windows, and began murmuring to their seatmates. Cynthia Wells was among the first to express her displeasure. What's the holdup? She demanded, pressing her call button with theatrical impatience. I have a connecting flight in Chicago, and this delay is completely unacceptable. Thomas Elwood remained quiet in his window seat, but his weathered hands gripped the armrests slightly tighter. He had flown enough to know that unscheduled delays were rarely good news. A part of him wondered if his letter to Captain Whitmore had somehow caused problems. Perhaps Jack didn't remember him, or worse, perhaps their past connection was somehow inappropriate in the modern airline industry. Kayla appeared at Cynthia's row, her professional composure intact despite the unusual circumstances. I apologize for the delay, ma'am. We should be underway shortly. This is ridiculous, Cynthia continued, her voice rising enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. What kind of passenger situation could possibly require stopping an entire flight? This is exactly the kind of unprofessional service I was talking about earlier. Her pointed glance toward Thomas was unmistakable, and several passengers followed her gaze. The implication was clear. She blamed the delay on the man she'd already tried to have removed from first class. Thomas felt the familiar weight of being the center of unwanted attention, but he maintained his dignity, staring straight ahead and refusing to acknowledge Cynthia's accusatory looks. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Jack was preparing for something unprecedented in his 15,000-hour career. He had made countless announcements over the years, routine safety briefings, weather updates, explanations for delays, but never anything like what he was about to say. Captain, Sarah said quietly, are you sure about this? We're going to have to file paperwork explaining the delay, and passenger complaints about schedule disruptions can be. Sarah, Jack interrupted gently, touching the pilot's wings in his shirt pocket. Some things are more important than schedules. He reached for the intercom microphone with a steady hand, though his heart was racing. Throughout the cabin, Passengers looked up expectantly as the familiar chime indicated that the captain was about to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Whitmore speaking from the flight deck." The cabin fell silent. Even the crying baby in row 12 seemed to pause, as if sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I apologize for the delay in our departure, but I need to ask for your patience for just a few more minutes. You see, there is someone very special on board our flight today, someone whose presence I only just discovered, and I would be remiss in my duties as both a pilot and a human being if I did not take this opportunity to acknowledge them properly." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers looked around, trying to identify who the captain might be referring to. Was there a celebrity on board? An official? Someone famous they had missed during boarding? Cynthia rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, for heaven's sake! What kind of circus is this airline running?" But Thomas had gone very still. Deep in his heart, he suspected what was about to happen, though part of him couldn't quite believe it. After a lifetime of quiet service, of teaching others to fly while remaining largely invisible himself, could it be that someone was finally going to see him for who he truly was? "I'm going to step out of the cockpit now," Captain Whitmore continued, his voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin, "to personally thank someone who changed not only my life, but the lives of countless others in ways that most people will never know or understand." The cockpit door opened, and Captain Jack Whitmore emerged in his full uniform, the crisp white shirt with its 4 gold stripes, the perfectly pressed navy jacket, the captain's cap that he wore only on special occasions. He moved down the aisle with purpose, his eyes fixed on a single destination. Every passenger in the cabin turned to follow his progress. The businessman closed his laptop. The family with children leaned into the aisle to get a better view. Even the flight attendants paused in their duties to watch their captain's unprecedented journey through the cabin. Cynthia's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion as she realized that Captain Whitmore was walking directly toward her row, but his eyes weren't on her. They were focused entirely on the dignified elderly man in the window seat, the man she had tried to have removed less than an hour earlier. Jack stopped directly beside Thomas's seat, and the entire aircraft seemed to hold its breath. Here was a moment 40 years in the making, a recognition that should have happened long ago, finally finding its proper time and place at 30,000 feet above the ground where both men belong. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Even the constant hum of the aircraft's environmental systems seemed muted, as if the plane itself was waiting to witness what was about to unfold. Captain Jack Whitmore stood in the aisle beside seat 2A, his uniform immaculate, his bearing dignified, but his eyes filled with an emotion that transcended professional protocol. Thomas Elwood looked up from his window seat, and for a moment, the years melted away. The weathered face of the elderly passenger transformed, and Jack could see the dedicated instructor who had shaped his understanding of flight, not just the technical aspects, but the honor and responsibility that came with commanding an aircraft. "Sir," Jack began, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin's silence, and every passenger strained to hear every word. "40 years ago, you taught me that flying wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. You taught me that every time we take to the sky, we carry the lives and dreams of everyone on board." Murmurs of curiosity rippled through the cabin. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The businessman in row 3 forgot entirely about his laptop. The family with children listened with rapt attention. Even the flight attendants had gathered to watch, their usual duties forgotten. Jack continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You taught me about precision, about preparation, about the sacred trust between a pilot and his passengers. But most importantly, you taught me about dignity, how to carry myself with honor even when others questioned my right to be in the cockpit." Thomas's eyes glistened, but he remained silent, his hands folded in his lap with the same quiet grace he had maintained throughout his life. "I wouldn't be flying this aircraft, or any aircraft, if it weren't for you," Jack said, and then, in a gesture that stunned everyone in the cabin, he slowly lowered himself to one knee beside Thomas's seat. The symbolism was powerful and unmistakable. Here was a decorated captain, a man who commanded respect throughout the airline industry, humbling himself before an elderly passenger that another traveler had tried to have removed from the cabin. But Jack wasn't finished. With deliberate precision, he brought his right hand to his forehead in a perfect military salute, crisp, respectful, and held with unwavering steadiness. The salute of a student honoring his teacher, of a protege acknowledging his mentor, of a man recognizing the giant upon whose shoulders he had built his career. The effect on the cabin was immediate and profound. A woman in row 5 began to cry silently. The businessman's mouth fell open in astonishment. Children pressed their faces to the windows between seats to get a better view of this unprecedented moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jack announced, still maintaining his salute, "I would like you to meet Thomas Elwood, the first black flight instructor in our airline's history." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Passengers began to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing, not just a reunion between former colleagues, but a recognition of courage and pioneering spirit that had helped shape modern aviation. Mr. Elwood trained dozens of pilots during an era when he wasn't even allowed to fly commercially as a passenger on many airlines. Jack continued, his voice filled with both pride and pain at the historical injustice. He faced barriers and challenges that most of us can't even imagine, yet he never let those obstacles diminish his dedication to teaching or his belief in his students' potential. Thomas finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry through the hushed cabin. "You always were my most attentive student, Captain Whitmore. I'm proud of the man and pilot you've become." The simple words, spoken with such genuine warmth and dignity, broke something open in the cabin. Applause began somewhere in the middle of the aircraft, tentative at first, then growing stronger and more widespread. Passengers throughout the plane began to clap, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm as they grasped the significance of the moment. Cynthia Wells sat frozen in her seat, her face a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and dawning realization. The man she had tried to have removed, the passenger she had deemed unworthy of first-class treatment, was being honored by the very captain whose skill would ensure their safe arrival in Chicago. Her complaints about premium experience suddenly seemed not just petty, but deeply shameful. The applause continued to build, and passengers began to stand. The family with children rose first, the father lifting his young daughter so she could see better. The businessman closed his laptop with a definitive snap and joined the standing ovation. Row by row, the entire first-class cabin rose to their feet. Jack finally lowered his salute but remained on one knee beside Thomas's seat. "Today is Mr. Elwood's final flight," he announced to the cabin. "He never asked for recognition or fanfare, that's never been his way. But after a lifetime of service to aviation, after helping to train the pilots who keep us all safe in the sky, he deserves acknowledgement for his contributions." Thomas placed a weathered hand on Jack's shoulder, a gesture that spoke of decades of respect and affection. "Get up, son," he said gently. "You have a plane to fly." But before Jack rose, he reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the small pair of pilot's wings that Thomas had given him 40 years earlier. With careful reverence, he pinned them to Thomas's overcoat, right over his heart. "These belong with you," Jack said. "They always have." As Jack finally stood and the applause reached its crescendo, something magical happened in the cabin of Flight 847. Barriers that had existed between strangers began to dissolve. The shared witness to this moment of recognition had created a temporary community among the passengers, bound together by their participation in setting a historical wrong right. Even Cynthia Wells found herself clapping, though her applause was quiet and filled with the weight of her earlier behavior. She had learned something profound about assumptions, about dignity, and about the danger of judging others based on appearances. The transformation of Flight 847 was nothing short of miraculous. What had begun as a routine commercial flight from Atlanta to Chicago had become something entirely different, a flying tribute to a man whose contributions to aviation had gone unrecognized for far too long. As Captain Whitmore returned to the cockpit, and the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, the atmosphere in the cabin buzzed with an energy that transcended typical passenger interactions. Thomas settled back into his window seat, the small pilot's wings now gleaming against his weathered overcoat. He touched them gently, remembering the day 40 years ago when he had first pinned an identical pair to Jack's uniform after his successful solo flight. The circle was complete in a way he had never expected. The takeoff was smooth and professional, Captain Whitmore's skills evident in every aspect of the departure. As the aircraft climbed through the clouds above Atlanta, passengers began to approach Thomas one by one, drawn by curiosity and genuine admiration for the man they had just learned about. The first visitor was unexpected. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez had wiggled free from her parents' watchful eyes and made her way to the front of the cabin, clutching a piece of paper and a crayon she had borrowed from her younger brother. "Excuse me, Mr. Elwood," she said with the fearless directness that only children possess. "I drew you a picture." Thomas looked down at the drawing, a simple but heartfelt sketch of an airplane with a figure in the cockpit wearing what appeared to be pilot's wings. At the bottom, in careful third-grade handwriting, Emma had written, "Thank you for teaching pilots to fly safe." "This is beautiful, Miss Emma," Thomas said, accepting the drawing with the same reverence he might show a diploma. "Thank you very much. My dad says you're a hero," Emma continued, oblivious to the tears forming in Thomas's eyes. "He says heroes are people who help others even when it's hard." "Your father is a wise man," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. As Emma returned to her seat, other passengers began to make their way forward. A retired military veteran named Harold Jennings approached with a firm handshake and knowing eyes. 26 years in the Air Force," Harold said simply. "I know what it took for you to do what you did, when you did it. Thank you for your service to aviation, sir." The gratitude was genuine and deeply felt. Harold understood the barriers that Thomas had faced, the courage required to persist in a field where he wasn't welcome, and the professionalism necessary to excel despite the obstacles. More passengers followed. A young pilot deadheading to Chicago introduced herself as Lisa Chun and asked if she could sit with Thomas for a few minutes to hear about the early days of commercial aviation training. A businessman who had initially seemed absorbed in his work approached to apologize for not acknowledging Thomas earlier, and to share that his own daughter was training to be a pilot. Even some of the coach passengers, having heard about the tribute from the flight attendants, found opportunities to walk past first class and offer their thanks. The usual boundaries between cabin sections seemed less important somehow, dissolved by the shared recognition of Thomas's significance. But perhaps the most meaningful interaction came from an unexpected source. Cynthia Wells had spent most of the flight in quiet contemplation, wrestling with the shame of her earlier behavior and trying to find the courage to make amends. Finally, as the aircraft began its descent into Chicago, she approached Thomas's seat. "Mr. Elwood," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology that no words can adequately express." Thomas looked up at her with the same patient dignity he had shown throughout the flight, waiting for her to continue. "I was wrong," Cynthia said, tears streaming down her face. "Not just about your seat assignment, but about everything. I judged you based on appearances, and I'm ashamed of my behavior. You deserve better, not just today, but throughout your entire career." Thomas studied her face for a long moment, seeing genuine remorse and the beginning of understanding. "Thank you for saying that, Miss Wells. We all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them." The simple grace of his response only made Cynthia cry harder. Here was a man offering forgiveness to someone who had treated him with disrespect, demonstrating the same dignity that had carried him through decades of similar encounters. As the plane descended through the clouds above Chicago, Kayla made her way to Thomas's seat one final time. "Mr. Elwood, I wanted you to know that the crew has been in touch with the ground staff in Chicago. There's going to be a small reception for you at the gate." Thomas looked puzzled. "That's really not necessary, miss. I just want to collect my luggage and head home." "I'm afraid it's too late for that." Kayla smiled. "Word has gotten out about today's flight. Some of your former students heard about your tribute, and they wanted to be there when you land." As Flight 847 touched down at O'Hare International Airport, Thomas pressed his face to the window and gasped. The jet bridge was lined with people in uniform, pilots, flight instructors, and airline staff, all standing at attention. Some were faces he recognized, students he had trained decades ago who were now captains themselves. Others were strangers who had heard about his legacy and wanted to honor his contributions to aviation. Captain Whitmore's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago. For most of you, this concludes your flight with us today. But for Mr. Thomas Elwood, this is the beginning of the recognition he has always deserved." As passengers began to disembark, Cynthia made one last gesture. She handed Thomas her business card and said quietly, "I run a foundation that supports education initiatives. If you ever want to share your story with young people who dream of flying, I would be honored to help make that happen." Thomas accepted the card with a nod of gratitude, understanding that her offer represented genuine change rather than mere guilt. When it was finally time for Thomas to leave the aircraft, Captain Whitmore was waiting for him at the door, having left the cockpit to personally escort his former instructor off the plane. Side by side, the two men walked down the jet bridge, not as captain and passenger, but as teacher and student, their roles now properly acknowledged after 4 decades of waiting. The crowd at the gate erupted in applause as Thomas emerged, and for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to accept the recognition he had always deflected. The young instructor who had faced discrimination and barriers had become an elderly man finally receiving his due honor. As Thomas disappeared into the crowd of well-wishers and former students, Kayla cleaned up the first-class cabin and reflected on the day's events. She picked up Emma's drawing, which Thomas had accidentally left behind in his excitement, and smiled. Some flights, she realized, were about more than just transportation. Some flights carried passengers toward long-overdue destinations of recognition, respect, and redemption. Flight 847 had landed safely in Chicago, but its real destination had been justice, and that journey was finally complete.